Consistency is key. You know what they say. Consistency can make or break the top fantasy players. Well, in this week's episode of the Fantasy Ruckers Show, we break down the top consistent fantasy Major League Rugby players from the 2024 year and what that means for the upcoming season in 2025. And let me tell you, there's some interesting tidbits you won't want to miss. The Fantasy Ruckers Show starts right now.
Where rugby and the world of fantasy sports collide. Welcome to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, talking all things rugby from the MLR to leagues around the world. We're on top of it. Headphones on, pads off. This is the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Now, here are your hosts, Ryan Yee, Matt Yee, and Devin Vanderpool.
What's up, everybody? This is episode 123 of the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Thank you so much for Fantasy Ruckers League members, our community members, and everyone else tagging along on this journey of making fantasy rugby a reality in the MLR with you each and every single week. Matt Yee, Devin, Andy Vanderpool, I am Ryan Yee. And boys, I mentioned it at the top of the show here in the teaser.
Oh, yeah?
We've been playing fantasy for quite some time, right?
Too long.
Whether it's football,
Too
rugby,
long.
other sports. It's true. It has been. It's caused a few more gray hairs, Vandy, than maybe what we need.
Can't grow them
But
if I try.
we've learned over the time, though, that there are some numbers, though, that do play in favor. And one of those numbers is consistency numbers. You guys good with some math? Or do you guys need me to help you out?
No, I'm actually not good with math.
Surprise, surprise, I'm not either.
That's why I am here. And in this episode, we got some interesting fantasy MLR stats for our viewers here. And the theme of it is consistency that we'll be talking about. And we know, Vandy, from our days of playing fantasy football, that those guys that you can count on each and every single week to get you those big time points and that you can really rely on, they have a special place in your heart. Isn't that right?
I haven't had one for a couple of years, but yeah, when I used to, they were awesome.
It's true. And we've learned that in fantasy MLR, there's some guys that come to mind when I had my first season here playing. Guys like Sam Tuifu, I could rely on quite a little bit there. Joel Hodgson for you, Vandy.
No, Joe
Peterson.
Joe Peterson.
Peterson.
Throwing it back.
I haven't had it as good as that yet. I haven't. Yeah, I really haven't.
There you go. And Maddie, I don't know if there's anyone that comes to mind for you,
but
used to be JP.
Used to be JP. Not this year, but we break down some of the most consistent fantasy MLR players according to the numbers in this episode.
And that's consistently good. Not consistently bad.
No, yes, consistently good. We do have the numbers, though, to say consistently bad as well. We got everything here. We got all the numbers here on the Fantasy Ruckers Show. But that's what this episode is all about. Like we said at the top, it's about consistency in this one. And this is the type of stuff that you'd like to dive deep into, the type of stuff you listen to the Fantasy Ruckers Show for, so that you can get that insight into being even more successful in the world of fantasy MLR and take some of these tidbits into your 2025 draft. I know that we're still ways away from the 2025 Fantasy MLR season. But hey, it's time to start taking notes here so that you can turn around what was maybe a mediocre 2024 season for you, Vandy, and go up here into maybe a little bit of a higher range here and make it into playoffs maybe for the first time, Vandy. But it's okay. We'll get there. Consistent. And that's the name of the game in this episode. But
consistently bad.
We also got news and notes to go over here in the show. We got a few things, including a draft that took place over the past week that we'll go over. But boys, before we get into it, fantasy football in full fledged. We have our Fantasy Ruckers League that we're taking on some of our community members in. I'm liking our squad. That draft wrapped up last week. May not have Fantasy MLR right now, but we do have fantasy sports.
Easy dub.
Yep. I'm just morale commissioner.
Commissioner, don't give you commissioner's title.
Morale team manager. I'm just there.
That's a weird name for roadie.
Yeah, that is. Huh? But hey, other than that though, boys, how have you been the past week? I feel like I ask you each and every single week. But have the withdrawals from Fantasy MLR sunk in yet? Are you missing it yet, or what?
They just bleed from one sport to the next.
It's true.
That is true. But the nice thing is there's lots of rugby to watch, lots of international rugby to watch.
Which I suck at, I guess.
Yeah, which we'll get into in
Which
our
yeah,
Devin's
yep.
Degenerate Dambles segment later in this show. That's true. Definitely tough,
Mm.
a tough sledding here for some of us here on the Fantasy Ruckers Show. But maybe it's the not so degenerate that is actually making some waves here and making some money. But nonetheless, we'll get into a jam-packed show, like we said, consistency numbers, news and notes, and a little bit of gambling on the side as well. But before we get into this episode 123, like we say every episode, if you aren't already, give us a follow at the Fantasy Ruckers, Twitter, or excuse me, X, Facebook,
Yes.
subscribe and like on YouTube. And it really helps us out a long way. We're still trying to get to that 100 subscriber number, right? Hit that milestone. Help us get there. We're dang close, and we'd love to hit that threshold as a big sign of Fantasy MLR growing here in the world of Major League Rugby. And it's also the first place to know all the socials, all of our platforms is the best way to be in the know how you can participate in Fantasy MLR coming up in the next season. So again, at the Fantasy Ruckers on socials, listen, subscribe, wherever you get your podcasts on the YouTube channel. Check out our website, thefantasyruckers.com. We got a Discord community as well down below that you can find in the description. All right, let's get into some news and notes, boys. Let's get it started right away. It is the off season, but there are a handful of
Correct.
things that is taking place right now that keeps it lively here, like you mentioned, Maddie, in terms of being in the rugby know. And the first thing is this coaching carousel that we are experiencing here in Major League Rugby. We talked about it last episode. We had two coaches find their homes, and that is as part of the New England Free Jacks, who hired Ryan Martin
Yeah.
from New Zealand. And then we got John Menenti going to the San Diego Legion from Australia. Funny enough, we have our third coach out of the five at the start of this, the five vacancies that began. It is the Nola Gold that have found their head coach that will lead their program here in the 2025 season. And funny enough, the guy that John Menenti replaced is going to New Orleans, and that is going to be Danny Lee going over to the Nola Gold. Maddie, thoughts on that?
Well, good for him. I mean, I'm not sure what would have caused him to leave, whether they just decided to part ways. Uh, I imagine San Diego's going to make their way back to the top next year and be a competitor. But maybe he saw more potential with this Nola Gold side, something that I've been seeing in them for years. And finally, Danny Lee is
Why
also
didn't they
seeing in
hire
them.
you as coach?
Well, you don't want me as coach. You're not going anywhere with that. But Danny Lee, I think, is a great signing. And he'll be able to he knows what success looks like with San Diego, and he'll be able to bring that over to NOLA and implant a nice little culture over there to win.
Yeah, former professional player, having caps with the All Blacks, standout performances with Otago, the Highlanders, and the Waikato Chiefs, and then also coaching, assistant coach with Hawke's Bay, and of course with the San Diego Legion, bringing them to a Shield match that they fell short in against New England last year. Didn't quite reach that same standard in 2024, but he'll look to do that with the New Orleans Gold coming up here in
Yeah.
2025. So Danny Lee, new head coach for the
And I
NOLA.
think and I think the big thing with coaching is that
Mhm.
you just look at their ties to players overseas, their nationalities, who they are. I mean, Nola Gold, they've already got some guys from New Zealand, Jordan Jackson Hope, Luke Campbell, those types of guys. They had what's his name? Tom Florence.
Mhm.
See who else maybe Danny Lee could bring over from New Zealand from his ties over with those MPC Bunnings Cup team.
Very true. All right, now moving over to some other big news that have happened, and you may have heard about it. The Major League Rugby draft took place last week, August 28th,
Great
on the
draft.
Rugby Network. We had Rugby Morning's John Fitzpatrick on the show last week. So if you missed that, check out episode 122. Breaks down the draft, breaks down some key names, especially what it means for the fantasy landscape and how they may make an impact. He was pretty close in terms of a lot of his predictions, in terms of where players are going where. Especially in that mock draft that he had that is released in his daily email that is curated for users every single morning. And we do have a home for many of these players. He predicted correctly. Eric Storty, the center from St. Mary's College,
Way
is
to
going
go.
to Anthem RC.
Cheater.
He also predicted that second overall pick, the hooker, the Canadian U.S. eligible hooker, Neil Trainer from Queen's University, heading
Cheater.
over to the Anthem as well. So that's a pretty big one. He did have some inside knowledge that he talked about last week. But you go down the list, a lot of young names here from a lot of notable places going to their new teams. We'll see who has the impact in this upcoming fantasy season. Again, if you want to hear more about that impact, check out the episode with Rugby Morning last week in episode 122. His over-under as a sneak preview is 5 of these rookies making an impact here in the fantasy season that will be waiver eligible or waiver worthy of a pickup. We'll see if it hits that number. But guys, just quickly, overall thoughts. This happened last week. Some of the names you saw, some of the trends. What were your thoughts?
Hey, Vandy, that Utah team loves their BYU boys.
Dude, I just want to know what's
do.
going on in the water at St. Mary's College of California.
They're a great rugby program.
Hey, yeah, check the water.
Yeah.
Check the water. But hey, don't sleep on those BYU boys that Utah's picking up.
It is very funny.
You gotta stay loyal to the Bible Belt.
Yeah, it's
and
true.
They need to draft from BYU in order to keep their boys part of the culture.
No, it's to keep funding up from Utah or else.
Keep the funding up from Utah, making sure that those Quakes are coming in on timely manner.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, Vandy, where's your inside knowledge from Utah? You know, I see Fitzy over here getting inside knowledge from all these Old Glory DC, and I'm just waiting for you. I thought you were our source in the
Ever
build.
since he got cut from their player development program, he's kind of had a little bit of souring, right? Couldn't quite cut it as a prop, but it's okay.
You know what?
You're here on the Fantasy Ruckers Show. That means we got to keep you.
They cut me off. I let go of too much stuff during the fantasy season. They cut me off. The wells went dry.
Well, to put it short here, basically what we talked about last episode in terms of the impact of this draft, Fitzy thinks that Anthem Rugby Carolina is probably going to be the team to look out for in terms of some of these young names to make an impact from a fantasy sense. Eric Storty being kind of the guy that he really highlighted, especially at that center position, which we know has a lot of point production in the world of fantasy. And the whole thing about Anthem is to give some of these guys, especially these US eligible guys, an opportunity to develop and use it as a platform and a launching pad to get into a spot onto that USA men's Eagles team. So we'll see. Again, Eric Storty, it's the #1 pick, joins guys like Sam Galla, Connor Mooneyham as guys that were #1 overall picks. Obviously, the marquee has been Sam Galla in terms of fantasy as a guy that came in and has really made an impact right away. We really haven't seen that since, at least from that #1 pick. Junior Goffa was the guy last year that kind of had that really big impact from a fantasy sense, was drafted later in that first round. And was named Rookie of the Year this past season. So we'll see. We'll see out of the list of these names who will have a fantasy impact. But again, if you want a deeper dive into all of that, check out episode 122. We really go into some names. Fitzy goes into some in-depth names because he knows all this stuff. He has way too much time on his hands to deep dive on some of these younger guys that you may not know about. So check out episode 122 of the Fantasy Ruckers Show. And then moving on here, there's some roster moves that we do need to catch up on in terms of moves that were made over the past week. Not necessarily really notable signings, but a lot of homegrown signings that both Anthem Rugby Carolina made and also San Diego Legion. So if you aren't clear about the homegrown player policy, MLR teams are able to designate up to 5 academy players as homegrown each year. And essentially, to achieve that homegrown designation, they need to be enrolled in the academy for at least 12 months continuously and participated in at least 35 training sessions or competed in at least 8 academy competition matches and 35 training development sessions. So either 8 matches or 12 months in addition to 35 training sessions. So some of the players that reached that status, at least for Anthem, you got Quentin Tyndall from Cal Poly, Ishmael and Safodian of Life University, Colin Turner, Ethan Howard from Davenport, and Alejandro Martinez Tapia from Lindenwood University. And then for San Diego, Aiden Conja is the homegrown talent there. So there we go. We have some homegrown guys that are coming through here.
Love to see it.
Homegrown.
Yep, you got it, Vandy.
Ishmael Safodian from Life University, Alejandro Martinez Tapia from Lindenwood, Colin Turner, Ethan Howard from Davenport, and Quentin Tyndall from Cal Poly going to Anthem. And again, Aiden Conja going to San Diego.
Probably Konya.
Aiden Konya. There we go. from San Diego State. All right. Shifting on to some of the international competitions, not overseas, but at least here on home soil. We did have the Pacific Nations Cup began. Canada did get a jump start against Japan, falling short, but it was the big USA versus Canada match over the weekend. Fitzy kind of alluded to that last week and had high hopes for the US, and the US did exactly that, beating Canada 28-15 in this one. Canada dropping it down to, I believe, 22 in the world ranking. So
Hey,
what
Canada
looks
stinks.
yeah, it's tough. It's very, very tough. But
They
on a
stink.
positive note, though, a lot
Nope.
of MLR representation, though, on both sides, which is cool to see.
Yeah, that is cool to see. And a lot of these guys are they just, when they play in the MLR, I think they're just in better outfits, on a better team with better coaching than they play for their country. And that's kind of sad to see. But that's specifically for Canada. US, obviously they're able to perform there on the bigger stage, in the international stage. And some of those MLR guys are really, really showing out.
Yeah, so I think it's now Canada falling to 0-2 in the Pacific Nations Cup. US now has the one win under their belt, so they sit in second in Pool B. Canada sitting in third. Going to be tough to see if they can jump back. Canada does have a bye. US faces Japan next, so we'll see. Obviously, Japan has been a strong side, and we'll see how that goes. But Canada starting with the 0-2 start, the US with the win, kind of contrasting starts to the Pacific Nations Cup.
That plus minus of -40. That's rough.
Real tough. Real tough.
That's tough.
Real tough for Canada. But anyways, 28-15, US on top there in the Pacific Nations Cup as
Trudeau's fault
continues to roll. Not getting into that. All right. So we don't have a Commissioners League update. I'm going to bless you guys without having to play the trumpets in this one. But I do want to
earplugs for nothing.
Goodness.
Yeah, I do want to remind the people, though, as a quick note, make sure you fill out that feedback questionnaire that we have posted on our Discord down below in the description to help us kind of revise and make improvements to the world of Fantasy MLR. It really is helpful. We've been getting great response from that and great feedback in terms of what we can do to make the experience and the platform even better. So we'd love to get even more responses for that. So link down below in that. But I will save Matt and Vandy the time of having to listen to those Supreme Commissioner trumpets, at least in this episode. I think might be the first episode in all of our episodes that we haven't played the trumpets. Should I play it anyways? Should I do it? Should I play it? Should I play it?
No,
Button's right here.
I bet you it's just so much. Think about how many more views you're going to get without the trumpets.
All right, we'll test it out. I won't hit the button. Won't hit the button. Yeah. All right. Well, let's get into what the theme of the show is all about, and that is consistency ranking. So, Vandy, before, as kind of our in-house kind of fantasy MLR student and the person we've been educating, but I will say a fantasy sports aficionado, to talk about fantasy overall, how nice is it when you have a guy on your roster, whether it be rugby, MLR, football, or any other fantasy sports, to have a guy that is just consistent each and every week, that is going to be getting you at least a solid performance each and every week. There's not many of them, but when you have one of those guys, it feels like you won the lottery.
I would say, you know what? Enjoy it while it lasts. It's a rare thing to behold in any fantasy sport where, the term plug and play, he's a lock. He's a set every week, set and forget. But I mean, there's nothing better. There's absolutely nothing better than at least knowing you have the term is a floor. Having a really solid floor is the greatest thing ever. And to have a guy with a really good floor and also a very high ceiling, like you said, Ryan, there's only a couple. Far
and few in between. And especially when we put it back into the fantasy MLR lens. I mean, with how volatile performances are when it comes to fantasy MLR. I mean, you guys have all experienced it. A lot of you who are listening and watching have all experienced that. It goes up and down. And a guy that goes off for you for 30 points one week may get you a big goose egg the next week, or may not even be starting. Or there's just a whole bunch of things, injuries, everything, lineup changes. It's just there's a whole lot of volatility. So the importance of finding some of these consistent guys becomes even more valuable when you're able to kind of snag some of these names that have been consistent. So we broke down the numbers. I collected the data, and our very own stats guru, Nick Johnson, who's also a commissioner in one of our handful of Fantasy Ruckers leagues. He is also our official Fantasy Ruckers stats guy in terms of breaking down analytics and really diving deep into numbers. And he sent us some really, really cool consistency metrics that we're going to break down in this episode and talk about some of these players who were very, very good for you all season long. And if you had some of these names, you were probably quite happy with their performances on a weekly basis, and probably were able to make some good pushes into the playoffs, if not winning yourself a Fantasy MLR champion. So the way that we're going to break this down is that we're going to go through each position in terms of who is the most consistent at each position. And the metrics are the percentage of times, and we break it down into 3 categories. The percentage of times the player was the best, the number one player in their position, the percentage of times they were in the top 10% at their position, and the number of times that they were, or the percent of the matches that they started in that they were in the top 25%.
Crazy math.
It is some crazy math. We said it at the top, but again, leader at their position in the percentage of matches, the highest percentage of top 10% finishes, and the percent of matches in the top 25%, top 25 position. So let's go down position by position, and let's talk about kind of the front row position. And this is a very, very volatile position, and especially when it comes to the guys that can get into this try zone, guys that took advantage of set piece. And you'll see a couple names on this as well, but you'll also see guys that just have a really solid floor that were able to kind of have a high percentage. And the player that is actually very surprising that is in the front row position that had the highest percentage of finishes as the number one player is Ben Strang.
I'm not surprised at all.
Ben Strang was your number one at 27%, was able to rack up the number one finishes. He had finishes at 7.4, 7.8, 11.1, and to finish off the season, 17.2 and 18.5 at the front row position. That is crazy. And I mean, 27% of the time, he was a quarter of the matches he started in, he was finishing as the number one front rower. That's pretty solid in terms of that. And then you go down the list, 36% as a top 10, and over half the time he was a top 25% finishing in the front row. Ben Strang, I think, is one of the marquee guys to have when it comes to Fantasy MLR at the front row position.
Yeah, I'm not really surprised there. I think he had a really good year and really under the radar year that we didn't really talk about him that much, but I think we just expected good performances from him week in, week out.
And the next player that I want to mention, because it comes hand in hand, again, maybe Ben Strang is the guy that finished as your top leader at that, but a guy that we have to mention is Andrew Quattrin. Now, Quattrin fell not too far behind of Ben Strang at 23% as the number one player in the front row. But this is the number that's going to get you crazy. Quattrin finished 50% of his matches, over 50%, 53% of his matches, he finished in the top 10% of all front rowers. He finished in the top 25%, 77% amount of the time. So more often than not, 35 out of the 12 matches, he started in 13. Out of the 13 matches he played in, essentially 10 of them were going to be a top 25% finish, which is also remarkable. Now, the question now lies, would you rather a Ben Strang, who maybe has a higher ceiling, or an Andrew Quattrin that is consistent? At least in these metrics, I would say Quattrin is probably more consistent, considering the fact that 76% of the time he was finishing in the top 25.
I would say that in a sense is a loaded question, just based off of what your roster has. When I was kind of alluding to things like floors and ceilings, what I meant is some guys in this thing, Ben Strang has a much higher ceiling. And Quattrin has a much better floor. So it's kind of something you look at your team and you go, well, if I got a bunch of guys who are consistent at hitting the floor, I would really like a couple guys that could have a high ceiling. And that's where the perfect roster management comes in. And that's why metrics like this are great. Because if you can look at a pick you had and go, okay, this is a really volatile guy, maybe your next two, you go, I want some consistency in here. I'm not looking for the next guy that's going to get me a 30 every 4 weeks. I need a guy who's going to get me 12, 15 every week.
Right. And it's very position specific too. Like front row, I'm probably the way that I make up my roster is probably the front row. I want a high floor because I would much rather get
Yeah.
consistent points out of my front row position than get, you know, a higher ceiling.
You know,
But if I'm looking at back three, maybe I'm okay with a little bit more, a little bit higher ceiling, and I'll give up some of that floor.
the problem is when they're completely unbalanced. So when you get an
Yes.
extremely high ceiling, and then your next 2-3 games you have a low, very low floor, and what that does, if you've ever played it, you could look at your last year from a total and being like, shit, I should have kept that guy. I only had 4 weeks of
Yeah.
bad games in a row. Well, when you're playing fantasy and you've seen a guy hasn't done anything for you for a month, it's pretty easy to let go of that guy. You could go,
Yeah.
sure, week one, he got me 30. But since then, he's gotten me 18 in 4 weeks.
Now, and I
Agreed.
guess, and that makes complete sense in terms of what Vandy's saying in terms of the roster makeup. You want to balance those guys. You want to have guys that could win you weeks, but you also want guys, I guess, for lack of better, teams that are not going to lose you weeks per se and
Yeah.
give you the goose egg. Now, when it comes to comparing Ben Strang and Andrew Quattrin, I mean, it's not that Ben Strang was not necessarily inconsistent, right? I mean, he
Yeah,
just
yeah,
had the
no.
more percentage of games that were as the leader, right? What we said, 27% of his matches that he played in, he finished as the number one front rower. Now, he still finished 36% in the top 10 and 54% over half of his matches in the top 25%. It's just crazy when you look at Quattrin's numbers. Like, I would, like, if you showed me these, like, to know that you're going to have a front rower that over 3/4 of the time that season is going to get you top 25 points or top 25
Mm-hmm.
performances at that front row position, the advantage that you have, it's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't surprise me if with this coming out just launches Quattrins. Obviously, there's a lot of time between now and the 2025 draft, but I mean, to be on the Free Jacks, on a solid team, can take advantage. Obviously, it's reflected through Quattrin's performance. I mean, I would take
Yeah.
77% top 25 performances, top 25% performances any day of the week.
Now, the last thing I do want to touch on with that is also another thing you have to look at. So, Quattrin and Ben Strang are two great comparisons because what separated them was a total of 3 points at the end of the season. Quattrin
Fair
finished
enough.
with 122.9, Ben Strang finished with 119.8. Literally 3 points. The only thing else I'd add to it is, when are you getting these numbers? Because we've seen, guys start out the season very hot and go cold. The only time, I would pick the guy who has the high ceiling when we're talking playoffs. Give me the guy with the high ceiling, especially if he's been good as of late, because there's nothing guaranteed. So I always, around playoff time when you're making that push, give me the ceiling, give me
Yeah.
all the points I can handle.
Yeah. So they have to be something that you consider, especially at the draft. Obviously, these guys will not be available for you to
Yep.
pick up or make those roster moves. But hey, maybe you're trying to cook up some trades, right? And maybe there's an option between acquiring someone like a Ben Strang or an
Yep.
Andrew Quattrin, and you're making a playoff push, and you know that you have a championship bid. You know which guys that you're going to be targeting here as roster moves. All right, let's shift on over now to the second row position. Another kind of two-name battle here when it comes to leader, when it comes to consistency rankings. The first name I am going to bring up is a guy that has been a marquee second row player for years when it comes to, ever since he's entered the league. We mentioned him as the number one overall pick, and that's Dallas Jackals Sam Galla. He started
Man.
in 9 matches this year, and 22% of them were the number one second row player. 33% were in the top 10%, and over 2/3 of his matches were in the top 25%. Again, there's a lot of volatility when it comes to the second row position, especially, but to have a guy that could consistently get you top 25% finishes is pretty crazy. And Sam Galla is a rare bunch. The other name I'm going to mention is Frank Lahore. He has a little bit under Sam Galla's leader percentage in terms of top second row positions at under 20% at 18.75. But then you get into kind of the same Quattrin and Ben Strang conversation where his top 10 and top 25% finishes just knock Sam Galla's out of the water in terms of 43% of his matches were in top 10. So you're maybe not getting that ceiling and getting him to finish as the number one leader, but he's at a more frequent rate going to be in that top 10%, even more so than Sam Galla as the guy that you unanimously think as the best second rower in all of fantasy MLR, and then 56% in the top 25%. So two names, I think we could have predicted it was going to be these two names because these were the guys that we're talking about when it came to second row position. But again, at the second row, to have 66% in Sam Gall's case or 56% in Frank Lahore's case as a top 25% second row finisher, that's fantastic.
Yeah. Now and second row is another position that I would take the floor any day of the week. Now, because it's so hard to find a guy with a floor in second row.
Well, the thing about second row too is a lot of like the top guys played back row as well. Some lost eligibility. Frank Lahore, you got super lucky with because he always mixed back in a second row game. So that's why his points are super inflated next to Sam Gall. It's just when he was playing back row, like I think he popped off for at least one game at 30 and another one for 20.
Yeah.
So that position's kind of tough because that one you get a lot of dual
It is true. It is true. And maybe that's the thing. Again, I think what we're learning as we break down these numbers is kind of the positional profile, positional point profile of each of these positions. And we talked about it before on this show in terms of, like Maddie mentioned, front rower, very volatile. You want a guy with the floor because that's such a big advantage to other positions. Second row, kind of same idea. And what we're learning too as well is that those guys that have second row, back row eligibility that do mix in at that back row position are far few in between. But if you can get your hands on one of those guys, you're going to have such a big advantage because of just the way the back row plays as opposed to the lock position from a fantasy sense and the numbers that they're going to capitalize on.
But you got to get a little lucky.
Minutes, hits, meters.
You got to get a little lucky with the way they mix back in because, we do a good job of after
eligibility. That's
3 weeks, they lose that eligibility. So, I mean, it's cute now. You can look at guys like, I think Jason Dam was pretty high up there, but he had a long stint of back row. So now, and then another thing, in that same breath, look at what numbers. So let's say Frank Lahore, you got him in your second row, but 3 of his 5 past weeks he played back row and got all his numbers. Well, then give me Gala.
Right. It's true. It's true. But it is a freak thing. And when some of these points you look at, like, I mean, Frank, 27.3 fantasy points at the second row position. That doesn't happen very often when you're starting at that. So again, Sam Galla, Frank Lahore, kind of your guys that are outliers. And a large part of that is due to these consistent performances that they're getting and the amount of times in their matches that they're finishing as among one of those top tier second row players. All right. The interesting one
I can't wait
here,
to see for this back row one.
Back row player. Back row is very, very interesting. And we break that down. 2 names again that we're going to mention. But when it comes to consistency, Sam Tuifua is the guy that we got to mention most. Now, he appeared or started in only 9 matches this season. You may think of the other name at first glance, but this is ridiculous, though.
Yeah,
Sam Tuifua, 9 matches that he started, 44% of the 9 matches he started finished as the best second row player. 66% of them he finished in the top 10%. 77% he was in the top 25. So Sam Tuifua, you can argue that I believe was an injury that Sam faced where he was out.
Well, he signed midway, and then he
signed
also
midway. True.
He played 5, 6, 7, 9
for a few games.
Yeah, he played 5, 6, 7, 9, 11, 14, 15, 16, 17, 19.
9 matches that he played. You're essentially just under half that you could. Probably odds are just below 50% guess that he's going to finish as the best back row player in the entire week. Now, the other name that we got to mention, a guy that had played very, very well is Semi Kunatani. Now, Semi Kunatani finished as the highest back row scoring player this season. But when you look at the numbers, wasn't always the number 1 player that he had. Only 9% did he finish as their top back row player, just because I feel like the threshold in which back row players score high points is there are many more options to go from. So he may have finished as the second or the third. But then you look at these other numbers, 36% the top 10, 90% in the top 25, almost every single time.
Yeah.
Semi Kunatani was finishing as a top 25% back row player, which is incredible. Now, both of these, again, I wouldn't necessarily discount Semi Kunatani's ceiling in these numbers, but I mean, I think if we both look at the top 25% and the rate at which these 2 players are finishing at, to have a player that is going to finish either a 77% in Sam Tuifua's case or 90% in Semi Kunatani's place, I mean, that's insane. You're
Yeah.
guaranteed a top performance almost from these guys.
Yeah, that is pretty nuts. That is pretty nuts. But I kind of expect that from Kunitani. I mean, that's literally the type of year that he had.
And
Oh,
but
it's
it's
just
crazy to think too is like he was also racking up those yellow cards. So
yeah.
like that's at the rate that he was doing that
Didn't
too.
matter.
And this
Two
is
of his
also
over 15-point games, he came off the bench too. So the
right. So
match started.
that doesn't even capture that,
That doesn't
right?
even
So it's
count.
90% of the matches he
Yeah.
started plus the ones he got in that. It just an absolute kind of albatross when it comes to who Sema Kunatani was
Oh
and
my
Sam
gosh.
Tuifua. And
Yeah.
I would imagine that those two guys, and I think a lot of these guys, but it's funny going through it right now. I think a lot of these guys are going to be at the top of draft boards next season,
And
right?
then bust for everybody.
Right, exactly.
That's the
Which is
MLR,
going to be
baby.
interesting. But hey, these are more numbers that we had, especially with the help of Nick Johnson, that we have now
Thank you,
that we
Nick.
didn't have last season. So maybe it'll help us with our rankings. Maybe it'll help us with our top fives, Maddie, when we break that down early next
Probably
year.
won't.
All right. Moving off to the scrum half position. This is a very, very interesting one because I think what I'm going to reveal here is actually more indicative of kind of what Matthew was alluding to in terms of the player profile. And the only player that really was at any point here from the scrum half position notable to mention was Andre Warner. And Andre Warner was a
Tupac?
guy
Vandy.
that finished off as 30% as a leader in the 14 matches he played as the leader, 30% in the top 10, and 42% in the top 25. You look at any other numbers and any other nines, no nine has even close to the percentages of what Andre Warner has. So
What a
they may have
weapon.
hit those thresholds. Connor Connor Tupai may have hit those numbers here and there, but just not at a frequent rate, which
Jeez,
means which means that the scrum half position itself, what I'm alluding to, is just the most volatile. You're gonna have guys that are gonna go off and get those high numbers. It doesn't take much, but then you're gonna have guys that go below and not get anything at all. So just interesting to see there. It just really falls off after Andre Warner, which is kind of how we remember the season, at least at the 9 position.
This is where it feels really good to have a guy who's consistent like Andre Warner. You
Give
just
me
throw
Connor
him in there and
Tupai
it's like,
still.
well, whatever.
I
man.
don't care about those metrics and that.
Whatever. You keep Connor Tupai, you keep losing, bud.
And that's what makes an interesting debate, though, is because again,
Connor Tupai outscored him.
To Maddie's point,
Yes.
is where do you want the profile of your player positions, right? Maddie has said he wants the floor in the front row. He wants the floor in the second row. He's saying now that he wants the floor in the scrum half position. Vandy, you're arguing that you want a guy that can bust off for 30 points at the 9 position because you can't find that anywhere else, right? What's better? I don't think there's a right answer. It's just interesting to see where those points are coming for. It just felt like Andre Warner. I think if you look at those two players, Connor Tupai and Andre Warner, you're looking at Andre Warner, who just consistently got you 10 points, 10 points, 10 points, 8 points, right? Or Connor Tupai, who either wasn't in the game and was subbing on, or was getting you 3 or 4 points, or he was busting out for 25, right? So it's kind of interesting player profiles there to compare with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
for sure.
All right. Another position that was kind of similar to that was the fly half position. And the fly half position, the leader in terms of the most percentage finishes as the number 1 player was actually Cliven Laubser. And he was a guy that had 8 matches started this season. 25% of them were as the leader. 25% of them were in the top 10. 37% were in the top 25. So Cliven Laubser, in the 8 matches that he played, was actually the guy that was getting you that highest ceiling when it came to the fly half position. Now, some of that did come from that back 3 eligibility that he had. So very, very, again, taking advantage of that dual eligibility. But we'll name a second name here because this is probably the name that a lot of people are looking at, and that is Jason Putros. So you may be getting the 25% from Cliven Laubser as that number 1 leader. But on the other side of things, Putros is still getting you 21% in the top 10. But this is the crazy stat. 71% of his matches were at top 25% finish, which is, again, over 3/4 of the time, or almost 3/4 of the time, you're expecting Putros to finish amongst the top 4 starting fly halves, which is, again, a floor that you really do like to have at a position that can be up and down at times, especially when you're searching for that kicker that's eligible there.
Now, the one thing I would say about eligibility, I've always felt with fly half, I'd rather him kick. If you're going to back, obviously fly halves are a commodity, so it's easier said than done to go get a new one.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things, if Patros all of a sudden he didn't, but let's say he lines up back three. I mean, I'm not sitting there going, hell yeah. I'm like, come on, man, give him the boot still. Because that is a very important position. Or
that's also what made Clive and Laubser, I think, so unique, was that he would start at back three position, but also kick.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So you would have him at the fly out position. You'd have him kicking, but he was scoring back three type points. Right.
Now, the one thing to always just remember about averages is, I mean, Nick did a great job of making sure right before all the percentages, you get to see a games played. So, in that one there,
Lobster's way less than Potros.
Way less. So in that
half.
Give me Potros. You know what I mean? If
Yeah.
I can get, let's say, even if he finished 10% more in the top as the leader. Okay. Well, if it was only in 8 games and I got Potros for 15 every day of the week, no-brainer for me.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I agree. All right, switching on over to the center position when it comes to consistency. This one was actually a very interesting one. And it kind of goes to the same point as what Vandy's saying there in terms of matches started. Now, when it comes to a percentage standpoint, Tian Lutz started 8 matches this season. 37% of those 8 matches were as the number 1 center player, which all translated to all of his top 10% finishes. Half of them, so 4 of those 8 matches, he finished in the top 25. Now, the other guy that you're going to mention is Wayne Vanderbank, who was MLR's Player of the Year, was one of the top scoring centers in Fantasy MLR. And he started in 4 more matches than what Tian Lutz did in 12 that he had. 25% as the leader, 25%. So those same matches were in the top 10%. 83% of those 12 matches were in the top 25%, which
Crazy.
Is, again, once you start breaking, I feel like once you start breaking that 75% threshold in terms of finishing in the top 25%, like that's just something you can rely on, right? The numbers don't lie when it comes to when you're playing essentially a whole season in Wayne Vanderbank's case outside of a couple matches. It's pretty outstanding.
Well, and to mention, the next one, top 50%, he's never finished in the bottom half as a center. Never. Not one time. Not a single game did you look at Wayne and go, you didn't really cut it. He cut it every single week.
Yeah. And there's a handful of guys, right, that finish with that 100%. And we'll talk into that, but you look
6 in the league. That's it. 6 guys.
You got Sam Tuifua, you got Michael Manson, who we'll get into, Wayne Vanderbank, Sam Gala, Semi Kunatani, and Sean McNulty, who always finish in the top half of their respective,
which is an insane metric.
Which you might be saying is even more important, like top 50%, right? Like that's just like, it's not going to kill you.
No,
right?
And that's what we're talking about. Floor, guaranteed floor,
right?
Guaranteed.
Right. Absolutely. All right, let's shift on now over to the back 3 position, and I mean, we don't even really need to spend much time, but it's Michael Manson.
So, like, awesome. Way to go, Manson.
This is a guy. Hey, there we go. We got a visitor here. We got Louis. What's going on, Louis? For those of you listening on the pod, Vandy's boy, Louis, making an appearance here on the show.
Hi.
Can you say hi? Say hello to the people, Louis.
Say hi to the people watching.
There you go. Louis saying hi to the Fantasy Ruckers.
He's got some ice cream, so he should be all good.
There you go. But continuing on the point there, though, back 3 position, Michael Manson. I mean, 33% as the leader, 41% in the top 10%, and 75% in the top 25%. Being one of those guys that finished as the 100% in the top half.
And this guy was never back of the year. Nope, not player of the year. Nope, none of that. So. Yeah, I don't understand that. Still going to point back to that, but yeah, it's pretty clear Manson was one of the best fantasy performers, both performance based with the number of high performances that he had and just consistency based. He was the guy.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. All right. And then to wrap up the consistency standpoint, we'll talk about defense set piece. I know we don't include these
Who the
rankings all
heck
the time.
cares?
I know, but it's just as volatile. I think it brings up the point. It's just as volatile as the scrum half position, where there was really actually only one
Chicago
name that you
Hounds.
can list. Can you guys guess which defense was the only one that we really need to talk about in terms of finishing as the best percent leaders?
Seattle
Hounds.
Seawolves.
Chicago
Seattle,
Hounds.
the Seattle
Come
Seawolves.
on.
The Seattle Seawolves, out of the 16 matches, of course, that they played in this year, 25% of them were finished as the number one defense set
Awesome.
piece on this season. Now,
Cares. Just pick
where it
anybody
doesn't
but
matter.
Anthem and you'll have a chance.
Sure. Because it really falls off after that, right? You got 18% in the top 10, right? 31% in the top 25. It fluctuates, and you just didn't have anyone, but at least from in terms of that ceiling that we're talking about, the 25%, Seattle was hitting that ceiling the
But look
most.
at Anthem, 0% in the top 1, 0% in the top 25.
Hey, what
0% in the
for the
top
top
50.
50? What's the next defense after Seattle in the top
All
50?
right, let's see. Top 50, next defense.
Oh God.
Wait, hold on. I think I know how to do this best. Hold on here.
I'm just interested.
It would be
Dallas Jackals.
the Dallas Jackals were actually higher than the
Wow.
Seattle Seawolves. So Dallas Jackals were in the top 50. New England was in the top 50. Seattle 56%. Dallas and New England 68% respectively.
All right, that's close enough. I'd still take
Yeah.
Seattle.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's interesting. But
Interesting stuff. Thanks,
there you go.
Nick. That's good old consistency stats. We
Again,
love to see it.
Nick Johnson, our analytics guy here as part of the Fantasy Ruckers team, also one of the commissioners of one of our leagues, will be continuing to provide us with some great numbers. If you're in our Discord channel, we actually have a fantasy analytics and a channel, and also he posts regularly in terms of just interesting tidbits. This is also something that we had in our questionnaire, but we're going to continue to drop kind of interesting stats, include some metrics in the upcoming season on our platform that we've been talking about, maybe even create a little bit of a draft kit that people can have, or a kind of a thing that people can even get even further analytics from us here as we break it down, which will give you even more insight to the world of Fantasy MLR. So stick around all off season long. We've got a lot of time of our hands without Fantasy MLR, so we're going to continue to break down some of these numbers and help you create the best team possible and prepare early here for the 2025 year. Before we move on here to our last segment, guys, what was probably the most interesting tidbit that you took from those consistency rankings?
I think for me, it really matters about, you got to look at the context of those stats. Like, consistency is great, but if you're consistent across 5 games, I would take a guy who's more volatile across 16 games.
Sure.
Yeah.
You know,
availability is the best ability, right?
That's what they always say about fantasy.
That is what they say. But I mean, for me, just seeing some of these guys with the 100% hit rates at above 50%.
I think that was the craziest metric to me, is that, you know, a guy like Wayne Vanderbank was guaranteed to finish top 50.
Like, so like, let's put it down, right? Like, so we look at
and if people are unaware of the lingo we're using, this is a perfect example of what we mean by floor and ceiling. If a top 50 was 100%, but let's say he only got in the leader 20, that's what we mean by floor and ceiling. His floor is guaranteed top 50 in the league. You're just not going to get the 30s.
Yeah. It's interesting. Very, very interesting. All right. Well, hey, again, we'll continue to bring you the numbers all off season long, continue to help you get better at making the preparations for your 2025 Fantasy MLR season. That was an interesting one, and we'll continue to bring that all off season long. All right. Time to get to our last segment of the show. We started this brand new, and that is Devin's Degenerate Dambles, brought to you by Betstamp. Betstamp, betting made easy. And again, we partnered with Betstamp to provide our Fantasy Ruckers community members an opportunity to get the best new user deals at the sportsbooks available in their state or province. So make sure you go check out that link down below, signupexpert.com/thefantasyruckers. You'll be able to see all of the sportsbooks that are available in your area, including all the best deals. In Pennsylvania, where I'm at, I was able to get DraftKings, BetMGM, Caesars, Bet Rivers, all these great sportsbooks, and get and capitalize on those great deals. Maddie's in New York. He was able to capitalize on it, and even our Canadian Canadian friends. Vandy up in Ontario was able to capitalize on some of the deals there. Also, if you like to play daily fantasy, that's another thing I want to mention. There are daily fantasy platforms that you can also take advantage there as well. Obviously, doesn't have rugby as of yet. Hopefully soon. But you can also take advantage of something like that. But let's break down the Devin's Degenerate Damble segment. We here in this offseason have taken on a brand new challenge, and that is the TFR betting challenge, where Vandy and I go head to head. Started off with $50, see who can last the longest, see who can make the most money. And 3 weeks into this thing, it's been tough sledding. It's been slow.
That many bets I've won.
Vandy is negative $30 in the hole. I actually am only negative $13 in the hole with a big time clutch win last week, picking the upset of Waikato over Auckland in the NPC Bunnings. We both missed on the championship with Argentina really sewering us with that loss against Australia. Yeah. That was tough. I did also bet on a player bet that I was able to find on Bet Rivers of
that didn't work.
What did I bet there, Maddie?
Will Jordan
scoring a try. He did not score a try.
He scores a try 90% of the matches he plays. So.
I know. It's literally because I bet him is the reason why he didn't score that try.
Is that the guy for the All Blacks?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, it's pretty good. But there are a lot of fun options here. Remaining bankroll for us with my $12 win with Waikato over Auckland. I have $37 left in the bankroll. So again, only minus 13. Vandy has dropped to $20 minus 30.
We're throwing it all in this week.
Oh boy.
$40 bet, baby. Let's go.
So we'll see. Let's see what you can do here, Vandy. We got some interesting ones.
Risking it all.
Top 14. I'm just going to lay down some of the options that we have for this week. And then Maddie, our kind of in-house league guru, is going to help us break us down. Top 14 is starting this weekend. We could pick some futures here. There, you can maybe pick the winners of the top 14 league right now. Cash in $2 there. You'll be able to ensure that you have maybe some winnings later in the future, or bet on some matches. Obviously, got a full slate with NPC Bunnings, Rugby Championship as well. So we look at the Rugby Championship first, because I feel like that's the thing that Vandy has now sided with. He completely avoided the NPC Bunnings last week.
I'm done. NPC
goes into the Rugby Championship, and we got 2 matches this weekend, both on Saturday. New Zealand is taking on South Africa. New Zealand are 5.5 underdogs.
Take the spread on both.
That one, and Australia taking on Argentina is the 4.5 point underdog in there. So Maddie, in the Rugby Championship, what are we thinking here?
Take the spread on both. Take the New Zealand plus 4.5.
Plus
was it 4.5? Plus 5.5. Okay. And take Argentina plus 4.5.
So you think New Zealand's going to lose by less than 5.5?
So Maddie's essentially saying New Zealand is going to win or lose by less than 5.5, or 6, lose by less than 6, or Australia and the Australia match. He thinks that Australia is going to either win, which they did beat Argentina last week, or lose by less than 5. We'll see.
5 is pretty big. 5 is pretty big. I think that's a bit too big of a spread for me.
You just said you'd pick Australia.
No, I know. That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
That's what I'm saying. Like, I don't think Argentina is going to beat Australia by more than 5.
Okay.
Like, it should be small.
Should the fact that it's 5 beat New Zealand by 5.5?
I don't think so. Not the way the game went last week.
It was close.
So what? They're just redoing these games again?
Well, they're in the same place.
They're doing double, like they play back-to-backs against the same team.
Oh.
Yeah.
So
speaking of top 14, just throw like a little future on Toulouse winning it. All right, just throw it in there.
They are the favorites. They are the favorites to win it at plus 100. I was thinking it was a Stade Francais that came in second, and they're at plus 1400. And I feel like you put $10 there to win 140. Like, that's not that bad. Like,
yeah, not too bad.
You know, but I feel like the bookies obviously know something. I don't watch the top 14. If any of our viewers watch the top 14, let us know.
I was just going on where Anton
Dupont you don't know.
I could allude here that usually with these futures, that is very rarely ever the best bet. I love future bets. I make a ton before the season
maybe
starts.
This is yours. So, Vanny, for you who don't know, top 14 is the French league. They're the France version of MLR, essentially.
Okay.
So, hey, maybe you place a future bet. Stade Francais finished second last year, and they're plus 14.
You know what? You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to plan a future, so then no matter what, I'm never out of this.
That's what I'm saying. That's what I was
Nice.
thinking. I was like, that you could do that. Some other
Put it down.
futures.
Yeah, I'll
since-
take
since
the
we're
rest
on-
of my 20.
Since we're on the topic of futures, some other things that you can get on here. The European Champions Cup is something that you can capitalize on. The URC is starting relatively soon that you can capitalize on. So lots of future bets that you can cash in on. All right. Matthew is the specialist though at the NPC Bunnings. So what are we looking at here when it comes to some of these Bunnings games? Not as many. They don't have any of the Sunday games up yet on DraftKings.
Okay.
But is there anything that you like?
I like Wellington over Southland.
Okay.
And
The
if
spread
North-
is 20.5 points in that one.
Oh, is this NPC?
yeah,
Bunnings?
don't take the spread. I mean, I
All
would
right, yeah.
actually
See you
take.
guys.
I would
Have a
actually.
good night.
I would actually take the Southland spread on that one.
You think
Like,
they'll
I
lose
would-
by less than 20.5?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
And then is North Harbor underdogs?
North Harbor are the underdogs at plus 7.5 underdogs.
Don't
I
even.
wouldn't parlay this one,
No way.
but I would do this a standalone bet.
You know what
Bet
you
on-
do.
money
bet
line.
on
Okay,
Harbor.
The money,
Okay,
the
line.
money
Okay.
line.
I got
The
one
money
question.
line for North Harbor and
Yeah.
North Harbor and Auckland is plus 205. So you bet 5, you get 10.
Okay, I got one question. I got one.
What's up?
When Ryan wins this bet, what cut you get? Because you
I
know
don't
what
get
you're
nothing.
doing. You know what you're
Ryan
doing.
didn't even listen to me last
I didn't even
week.
listen. He didn't tell me the Waikato Auckland. I went against him.
I said, don't do that one.
You know what
I
this
did
is?
that. I went on
ever
that
done
on
that?
my own
Vandy-
provocative.
ever done
Vandy,
this?
I give you every bet that I think is gonna hit.
Yeah, but you give
And
me
you
the
haven't
spicy
listened to
ones
any of
that
them.
you know I'm going to take, and I take them every time because I'm a goddamn degenerate.
Anyways, lots
Hey,
of
take that North Harbor spread though.
take the North Harbor spread.
Auckland actually looks like doo-doo this year.
Okay. Okay, North Harbor spread or just the straight money line?
Do the spread. What's the
Mu-
spread?
The spread is 7.5.
Yeah. Do the spread.
Okay. You don't think North Harbor will win?
I mean, hey, if you want to be crazy, take the win. But I'm just saying, trying to give you guys some leeway to just win some money back.
Yeah, I
and
need
take
it.
the spread.
I need it.
Take the spread.
That might be something I cash in on. North Harbor spread.
Auckland has been doo-doo this year.
I'm starting to hate spreads in rugby.
Yeah.
I don't think they
Stop.
set them right. I don't.
Well, these are the maybe the what's it called? The cash cows where they don't really overlook these kind of minutiae sports. You know, Vandy. You
Dude,
know.
this
You just
one
gotta-
time-
you gotta
Dude,
find your
this-
groove.
Side note, but I remember on Reddit one time, this guy used to he used to post ping pong championships in China. Okay. So you'd have to bet on him. The games were like 4 a.m. This guy, I followed him all season. He ended up like 25 and like 3.
Yeah.
The most money I ever made.
Maybe this rugby is one of those that you could take advantage of. Well, if you want to join in on the TFR betting challenge, you can do so by checking out the link down below, signupexpert.com/thefantasyruckers. We partner with Betstamp to give you guys the best new user deals. Take part in the challenge, take part in some of the tips and tricks that Maddie's trying to give you insight into. It sounds like North Harbor, the spread at 7.5 underdogs, is the way to possibly go this weekend. Matches on Friday at 10:05 p.m. Eastern time. All right. Well, hey, fun episode, boys. Lots of numbers in that one. You
Lots of
guys
numbers,
okay?
lots of percentages. No, I'm not okay, but
Yeah,
you
I've
know
never
what?
been
We're
a
gonna have a
math
good
guy.
weekend. We're gonna have a good
I'm
weekend.
gonna have to
Well,
go
Vandy,
detox.
you graduated.
rugby.
You graduated TFR mathematics, so you're good.
That's a pretty low bar.
That's
First
true.
mathematics course I can pass, boys.
There you go. All right. Well, hey, for Vandy, for Matt Yee, I am Ryan Yee. We'll
Bam!
see you next week on another episode of the Fantasy Ruckers Show.
1 + 1 = potato.
You've been listening to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, covering everything rugby from the MLR and beyond. We hope you enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review, and be sure to tell all your friends. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, connect with us on social media at the Fantasy Ruckers. Till next time, this is the Fantasy Ruckers Show, signing off.